So I would like to introduce everyone to Dr. Brett Andersen. He is going to be talking about navigating the public educational system, specifically talking about evaluations, 504 plans, and IEPs. Dr. Brett Andersen is a Scottsdale-based licensed psychologist. He conducts primarily psychoeducational evaluations for children and adolescents for a variety of reasons. His most common referral questions relate to dyslexia, ADHD, ADD, autism, and behavioral problems. He also conducts independent educational evaluations when parents dispute a school's evaluation. He has been in the field for over 10 years, and in addition to his private practice, he also currently works as a school psychologist for a public school district here in Arizona. Welcome, Dr. Andersen.
Thank you, Fazia, for the nice introduction there. I didn't get any chance to ask any questions about fusion. You didn't prompt me to ask any questions. I did have a question, but I guess I could go back to that later at some point. For this, while I have an opportunity to share my screen, I don't see that I'm able to.
Yes, you should have the opportunity to share your screen.
Okay, let me take a look here. Oh, perfect. No, it looks like it's gone. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, navigating the public educational system?
Yes, that is the correct one.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. I'll go ahead and jump into it here. So thanks again for the nice introduction. To kind of elaborate a little bit further, so I've been in the field for over 10 years, and I started off my career in Illinois and Missouri, and then now in Arizona. I feel like working over multiple states, it's given me good experience to see how it's done in different parts of the country, that being different educational practices, similarities, differences, what are good about certain things, maybe things that could be improved upon, that sort of thing. But so anyway, for this conversation, I'm mainly going to be talking about how to navigate the public educational system within the state of Arizona. As I go through, I will discuss not only federal regulations, but state regulations and district policy. What does this all mean? It means this conversation is going to be quite dry. I actually had a pretty funny, or what I thought was a funny slide next, but I actually decided to do away with that because it probably would only be pretty funny if there was a large audience. But since we have a small audience here, I decided to do away with that and just basically tell everybody, like, I hope your summer is good, and hopefully that anyone that is in education, that you're able to enjoy the month of June off, because I know for myself, I work, I'm going to try to actually go back for a second. In addition to my private practice, where I do evaluations in a clinic myself, I also work part-time, well, technically full-time, for a local school district. And I know the summer goes really fast. So before we know it, June will be over, and we'll be back either in school or have our kids back in school. So anyway, hopefully the summer is going well for everyone. So at the moment, I don't have anyone that would share really probably any personal kid information, but anyway, just want to make it clear that there's no confidentiality throughout this process. So if someone did share information, that it's an open forum. But anyway, questions can be asked, however. So the process, or basically this conversation, is about really any sort of accommodations or what you could do in the school environment. So in the school environment, you could do an evaluation. So I have on the left there, just a classroom, or you could go through a private evaluation. So I just Googled clinic in Arizona to try and find a picture, and that's actually the Mayo Clinic to the right there. But so evaluations can take place in a school setting, and could take place in a private setting. Is one better than the other? No, definitely not. They have their different purposes for sure. You wouldn't want to go do a school evaluation if the purpose is for a complete medical condition and you're wanting to figure out, I want an evaluation to figure out what sort of cognitive rehabilitation therapy I should have. That's not really something a school evaluation would do, unless it's a medical condition. We're figuring out how we can best intervene for the medical condition in the school. But for how to intervene in an outpatient rehabilitation setting, that's something you go probably to a clinic for. And then, so another thing is for school evaluations, the whole purpose of a school evaluation is to figure out, and I don't know how I lost my slide there, but to figure out how are we going to intervene within a school setting. Versus a clinic evaluation could inform outpatient practice, or a clinical evaluation, a private evaluation, could actually inform school-based practices. So how is that? That is, if you work with a practitioner that is familiar with what it's like to function in educational regulations, working with a clinician in a clinic setting or a private setting can also give you a non-biased, more objective approach to whatever it is. So in private practice, I oftentimes have parents come to me saying that they disagree with the school or they don't feel their school is on their side. So if you go through a clinical evaluation, it's kind of independent in many ways. And that's kind of a glimpse or like a side note there. That's not to say that school evaluations are bad, or not all cases are like that for sure. As I mentioned, I actively work as a school psychologist in a local school district, and I find that the evaluations that I conduct to be well done. A lot of them are very beneficial for parents, or very appreciative, that sort of thing. So those are just kind of case-by-case examples of things that can come up with like a school-based evaluation or a private evaluation. So in terms of evaluations, special education, 504s, IEPs, there's three things to consider. Is if anything that's coming up related to an IEP, 504, special education, accommodations, modifications in the classroom, is this a federal issue? If it's a federal issue, meaning that the government is who basically enforce these regulations, it would fall under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So this is basically what is known as special education, is IDEA. That's what governs pretty much all educational laws on a federal level. It started in Public Law 1994. Public Law 91-142 started in 1975. So it's been around for quite a while, but probably for the first several years or so, it wasn't something that was probably at the forefront of people's minds. And what it looks like today is certainly completely different than what it looked like in the 80s. But anyway, there's federal regulations, and then there's state statutes. So the state of Arizona has its own state statutes, which is Arizona Revised Statutes, or the Arizona Administrative Code, ARS or AAC, and that's specific to the state of Arizona. Federal regulations are certainly more broad than state regulations. So basically, the federal regulations set out the groundwork. States then, for the most part, carry out whatever the federal government tells us to, but then we'll be more specific. So the federal government may have not stated specific logistics for a certain issue. That's where it's up to the state to further define it. And then outside of that, so you got the federal, which is most broad, and then narrowing it down a little bit to the state. And then even more so, you have, I need to move this out of the way, which is district policy. I just Googled districts in Phoenix or something. This was kind of a cool thing that I got set up, or that I saw in terms of images. You can see here in Phoenix, all these school districts that are super close to each other. You got Levine, Roosevelt, Riverside, Murphy, Isaac, Alhambra, Cartwright, etc. So most, so like all these are within Phoenix. These public school districts, they'll have to follow federal regulations. They'll have to follow state regulations, but then they can do certain things in terms of district policy. And you might find with your child that certain practices are enforced at Isaac, where if you then transfer, move across whatever street this might be, looks like it's 51st Avenue. and you go to Maryvale or Cartwright, then you might find it to be completely different. A good example of this is the eligibility, special education eligibility category of a learning disability. For a specific learning disability, every district in the state of Arizona can choose what model that they want to use to determine a kid eligible for a learning disability. So if you're in Roosevelt and you move across whatever here is the Salt River Canal, I guess, if you move school boundaries from Roosevelt to Levine to Riverside, your child may have received services for a learning disability, and then when you move, they may no longer meet criteria based on whatever that district uses. That certainly can be frustrating for many people, including myself as a practitioner, because it's like, well, then having to explain to a child why, or to a parent, why a kid got services one place and then they move across the street and they no longer get it. Certainly frustrating. Sorry, I lost my presentation. Okay, back to it. So that covers the different things. As I go through, I'll kind of mention what is federal versus state versus district policy. Now, something that is across the board from which is a federal regulation is the notion of child find. Basically, child find is where schools have to identify, locate any child with a disability from birth to 21 within their school boundaries, and then provide them with special education services. In Arizona, if you attend a public or charter school, typically you will have individuals that are employed by the school district to provide any special education services. So pretty much, I can't think of a public school that doesn't have school psychologists to provide evaluations. That's pretty much a given. Now, charter schools may have school psychologists employed themselves, or they might contract out for school psychologists, but it's pretty much the same process regardless. The main difference in terms of like the school psychologist role from a public school to a charter school may be that the school psychologist in the public school is usually going to be an internal employee. They're going to be there. It's kind of their job all the time. Whereas in a charter school, a lot of times it's more of an it could be an internal employee that they have there all the time, but sometimes it might also be an external employee where they go through a staffing agency or something of that nature. And that too is actually the case even for public schools. The first time that I entered the school district that I currently work in, I actually was hired by a staffing agency, and now I work as a district employee. So can be some differences there. Now for private schools typically, I can't think of any private schools, maybe a couple that have school psychologists employed by the private school. Typically for private schools, if an evaluation comes up, a request for an evaluation, the private schools will contact the public school in which the child resides and utilize the school psychologist or the educational team at the public school in which the child resides, although they attend the private school. In the state of Arizona, it's a little bit different for if you have special education services through a public school versus private. Private schools oftentimes offer things like an ISP, an individual service plan, as opposed to an IEP. And there are some definite differences there. I'm not going to go into all those for this because my conversation of talking about IEPs, 504s, educational plans, I could easily spend 4+ hours talking about any one of those individual things, and talking about IEPs and 504s mainly within hours, quite an extensive and daunting task. So I'm going to limit it to mainly that. But if you do have questions about special education service within a private school setting, feel free to contact me separately, and I'm more than happy to discuss that. So in terms of an evaluation process through the state of Arizona, I definitely recommend that you request an evaluation in writing. The reason why is because the Arizona regulations specifically state that the the request should be in writing. Parents can make a verbal request, but school districts could technically not respond to a verbal request because that's not what's written in the actual regulations. But if a parent makes a written request, then school districts must respond to that request within 15 school days. And that school days is a really important thing. It's not calendar days, it's actual school days. So if there's a break, that is not going to count as a school day. So it has to be 15 school days. But once a parent writes a request, and usually if a parent were to ask me for any like advice of what to write, I would just say, keep it short, just send an email or write in a letter. I usually go email, is just send an email and say, I want my child tested for special education. And then obviously when you send an email, it has the date, time, the time on it. So that's a pretty solid record there. If you were to put it in a written form, like actually handwrite it, you could do the same thing, just write, I want my child tested for special education, include the child's name, date of birth, and the date that you wrote the request. And then you give it to a staff member. You can give the request for the special education evaluation to any staff member, but there are certainly staff members that are more keen or more aware of special education processes than others. So my recommendation would be to give it to a school administrator, such as like principal, assistant principal, school counselor, social worker, or someone directly involved in special education, like special education teacher, school psychologists, etc. School psychologists would ideally be the person that you give the special education request to. And the main reason is because they're the one who chairs the special education evaluation, meaning they're the one that's going to be kind of heading the entire process. So it really kind of starts with them and they get everything rolling. So the best person to give a special education request to is the school psychologist. So what happens after you request a special education evaluation? Magic. No, it's not magic. It's pretty straightforward. So once you request a special education evaluation in writing, the school district can immediately reject the request, but if they do that, they have to do it through a written notice. PWN stands for prior written notice. It's basically this actual formal form that specifically states that they're going to reject their evaluation. And they could technically do that without actually holding a meeting and reject evaluation and issue a PWN. But parents certainly have different sort of rights to be able to appeal different things. So if a parent requests an evaluation, the school district rejects the request for the evaluation, the parent could file for mediation or due process to be able to contest the reject for the evaluation. And then it would just go through the different channels that way. So you request an evaluation, school districts could immediately reject it, or what happens in most cases, I would say it's relatively rare, it's not frequent, where if you make a request for an evaluation that you just get a PWN rejecting the request. I can't remember the last time I've done that or if I've ever done that. I really can't think of a time where a parent's made a request for an evaluation and I, as a school psychologist, just issued a PWN. What I typically do is at least hold a meeting to discuss it. There are certainly times where a parent might request an evaluation, but I think if I am going to suggest that the team not proceed with an evaluation, I would like to do it with the parent, like talk to them about the reasons why and come up with a plan. Because I view it like if someone's going to make a request for an evaluation, there's concern. So I would want to address those concerns. And I think it's much better done in a meeting where I'm able to talk it through with the parent as opposed to just signing a letter and kind of going from there. So if you request an evaluation and it goes to an actual meeting, it's called a couple of different things depending on where you are. Most people call it a review of existing data meeting, which is a RED. Alternatively, some people call it a MET. MET stands for Multidisciplinary Evaluation Team. And I think that term is very well put because through a special education evaluation, there are certain team members that have to be present. The parent, general education teacher, special education teacher, a district representative, and an individual to interpret the instructional implications. And those are the same 5 team members that have to make up an IEP meeting, which I'll talk about later. And so the multidisciplinary evaluation team is comprised of these different individuals: parent, teacher, general ed teacher, regular ed teacher, school psychologist, etc. That all have their own specialties. It's a multidisciplinary team. And specifically through the evaluation process, it's a multidisciplinary evaluation team. And the interesting thing, going back to a school-based evaluation and clinic-based evaluation, if you go to a clinical psychologist or a licensed psychologist in private practice, you're going to have an evaluation. They're going to give you a diagnosis, or they'll give you their recommendations, and it comes from that person. That professional is the one that basically calls the shots and makes a conclusion. Completely different in the school setting. It's a team decision. It always has to be a team decision. A evaluation in the school setting by the Met is always team-based. It's never based on one individual. And if it comes across that way and you feel like, oh, the school psychologist determined this, well, that can't be the case. It has to be a team decision. And as a parent, if you disagree with the team's decision, then there are certain things that you can do to be able to appeal that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But going back in terms of acronyms, you request evaluation in writing. Either the school will just write a PWN and reject it, or they'll have a meeting, and the meeting will likely be called either a RED or a MET 1. An alternative term could be also a domain meeting. And there's probably also a million other terms there, because a lot of school districts like to be different and come up with their own terms. So that could also be the case, but those are the 2 most common in the state of Arizona, at least. What does an evaluation look like? Well, I guess it kind of looks like this. That's a common question that I'll get. It's basically the person, the evaluator, like school psychologist, working with the kid. This here is not any particular test that I know of. It looks like they're just kind of matching shapes or something, which is actually kind of a good thing. You wouldn't want to be able to find images of a professional administering the actual test that's given, because it could violate test security. It's good for the test items to not be well known by the general public, so then you can get a true reading on how somebody performs. So anyway, it's the adult, they're the school psychologist or speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, etc., just working with the kid. And it kind of looks similar to this, nothing like super magical or whatever. Most tests, you sit across the table from the child, or maybe you sit kitty corner. It kind of looks like they're saying directly next to each other. But a lot of times you sit kind of kitty corner and you're just working with the kid. Now a lot of people will tend to really fear evaluations. They'll fear like testing. For good reason. I know, like when I was in school, I didn't particularly like tests, but through this process, an evaluation process, I think of an assessment as being not necessarily something we care about what the child is getting right and wrong. I mean, that's important, but being able to understand why they're coming to an answer that they do. So myself, whenever I'm working with a kid, I want it to be a good experience, and I want them to feel better about themselves than they did when they started working with me. How am I able to do that? I guess one, by just establishing good rapport. So whenever I work with a child, the most important thing is for them to feel comfortable. How is that done? It kind of just depends on the child and individual. It's like meeting a new person. So if you walk up to a new person on the street, how do you make them feel comfortable? I don't know. You just kind of figure it out. And some people have better interpersonal skills and social skills, social communication skills than others. I think throughout the years, I tried to just do whatever to figure out how to improve on them. But of course, I'll get things wrong at times. I think what's most important is you try your best to just make people feel comfortable. A lot of times that can be done through humor. Most people like jokes. Now, if somebody is really sad, really anxious, jokes are usually not a good thing. Then it's a little bit better idea of being factual. But I guess too, with experience, the more experience you have encountering people, different people, whether it's kids, adolescents, adults, etc., the better you kind of figure out ways of just making people feel more relaxed. A lot of times too, I would like to start off with like easier tasks, things that will be things that people can kind of knock out of the park. Maybe use some humor and kind of jokes around it. But usually approaching it that way will build up some good rapport, as opposed to sitting down with someone and asking them to do something that's a real area of weakness. That's not going to bode well for the rest of evaluation. So set the person up for success, make them feel comfortable in the process, and usually it works out pretty well. Yeah. So that's kind of a little bit about what the evaluation looks like. A lot of times parents will too be concerned about how many times are you going to work with the kid? How long is it going to take? So that can just vary. It varies for so many reasons, so many reasons. Sometimes you work with a child that's extremely verbal or maybe tangential or verbose, or maybe I could be verbose myself, or maybe you get a child that doesn't speak and maybe has a limited movements of their hands and arms. If that's the case, you're not going to be able to do as much if a child is not speaking and not able to really move, as opposed to a child that's speaking a lot and is very active. So yeah, some things that just kind of will dictate the pacing, the amount of times you work with them, etc. Once the evaluator or evaluators are finished with the evaluation, then you go over the evaluation results. It's usually called an eligibility determination meeting. It might also be called a MET2 meeting. Over here, I have this, what I thought was really funny diagram. It's funny in a sarcastic way. I sit in so many meetings. This was just pretty funny. So let's begin our meeting. Everybody talk, nobody listen. Of course, that doesn't ever come up. And usually it's really interesting from like a psychological perspective when you put a bunch of people in a meeting, in a group like this, and you have a meeting. Oftentimes, if there's too many sidebar conversations, there will be kind of just like natural leaders, so to speak, that will speak up and say, I notice everybody's talking, let's kind of break it down. That said, for eligibility determination meetings, the person that is the chair of the meetings, basically kind of the head of the meeting, is the school psychologist, provided that it's not like a speech only evaluation. If that's the case, then it would be the speech language pathologist. But anyway, regardless of the type of meeting, there should be a designated person that's going to facilitate the meeting, and hopefully they'll be able to make sure that not everybody's talking and that nobody is listening. It should be obviously the complete opposite. Hopefully by establishing good team meeting norms at the very beginning. As I mentioned before, in the school setting, it is a team decision. So once you're done with the evaluation, you as a parent will have the ability to say, if you agree that your child has whatever, or that they don't have whatever. So it's everybody is involved. Now, as I alluded to before, if the parent disagrees with the team's decision, there are certain things that can be done, which I do address that on a slide in the near future. So that will come up. The team, usually for at least a special education meeting, the outcome could result in a special education plan referred to as an individual education program, so an IEP, or the team might come to a conclusion that the child is not eligible for an IEP. Sometimes that could lend itself to something like a 504, but that's probably not going to be determined right then and there. It would probably go to a different meeting. And I'm going to discuss that in the near future here in terms of a 504. Right before I do that, I do want to mention, because, right now it's June. I actually have to look at my phone to figure out exactly what day. It's June 8th. So June 8th, most schools are not in school. Most schools are not in session, where most schools are out for the summer. And some of you might wonder, can an evaluation be delayed due to summer vacation? The answer is no. I've had a lot of parents contact me recently with like a lot of concern of like, well, school's out, we're not going to be able to do the evaluation until we come back or whatever. That's not actually the case. There are certainly 12-month employees within school districts, and you contact one of them, and you can't delay evaluations due to summer vacation. And there are summer evaluation teams that are currently year-round. So that is a thing. This is a side note that evaluations are typically, well, it's a federal law, federal regulation that evaluations have to occur within 60 days. The state of Arizona just carries that out like, yes, 60 days, 60 calendar days. This isn't a school time frame, it's or school days, it's actual calendar days. From 60 calendar days that you determine that you've received informed consent that you're going to do an evaluation, you have to come back and hold the evaluation results. In the state of Arizona, you can extend evaluations for an additional 30 days, provided that it's in the best interest of the child, not just because it's convenient for the school or to give someone extended time, the school psychologist extended time to do the evaluation. It has to be in the best interest of the child, and the parent and school have to agree in writing to the extension. So as a parent, if you feel that the school or whoever is dragging their feet, so to speak, conducting the evaluation, then they say to you like, can I have an additional 30 days to do this? It is an actual thing where we can extend it. If you agree, you as a parent don't have to agree to that, but if the school has been working with you and you're fine with it, then you certainly can do that, but you're not required to. I alluded to 504s as well as a couple other things that I'll get into at this point. So this diagram it's a lot for one. There's a ton of wording, but it's kind of the best way that I could figure out how to work it in. But I wanted to go over differences between IEPs and 504s. So the basics of it is, a lot of times if parents have concerns about their child and they want them to receive additional services, they think, well, okay, well, a 504 or an IEP is certainly something where a kid can get additional services, but there's a lot of very real differences between an IEP and a 504. And even more so than that, teachers can certainly give a kid accommodations and modifications without either of these documents. A lot of amazing teachers out there differentiate for kids without actually having a specific plan. What I find in my experiences a lot of times that teachers that are at younger grade levels will just kind of innately just do it. And then as a child gets older, a lot of times the adults, the teachers will think that they want the child to be like more independent, because like in high school, like after high school, like if you're not going on to college, like you're going to be entering the workforce, you need to be independent, you have to be functional at that point in time. So I find just like a general notion that maybe high school teachers will want to ensure the children are functional, where we're not just giving them accommodations, modifications for no reason, but that they are ready to take the next step. And that's not a bad thing at all. I think that's actually a really good thing to make sure that people are functional. But the main thing is that we provide children with what they need and not necessarily more. And that's actually a concept that comes up into special education and IEPs, is providing children in the least restrictive environment, meaning that we don't want to give kids, unnecessary things. For me, like, when I was in school, I didn't have any accommodations, but could I have benefited from extended time? Yeah, I think pretty much we all could. Could I have benefited from reduced assignments and modification? Well, yeah, I would have loved that. But did I need it? No, I didn't need it. So, and maybe not with however I was learning. And since I didn't need any modifications, if I would have been provided with those, maybe it could have served as a crutch to where it's like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about this. And it could have instilled characteristics in me that weren't necessarily beneficial. So you want to be able to push and challenge somebody at their instructional level. But if an individual has a disability, a lot of times they will require additional things that should be granted to them. Unfortunately, there's actual regulations related to IEPs and 504s, where if a child has a disability and qualifies for an IEP or 504, school district, just plain and simple, just has to follow it. So in general, what's the difference between an IEP and a 504? The main difference is that IEP, well, I'll start with 504s. The main difference is with 504s, it's a plan in which it allows people to be provided, allows children with disabilities or adults with disabilities to be provided with accommodations and modifications. So basically, being able to change things within the individual's environment to make them succeed. And it kind of looks at leveling the playing field. An IEP also does that. You can get the same accommodations on an IEP and a 5, or you can get the same accommodations and modifications on an IEP that you can get on a 504 as well. So that's really no different. But with an IEP, you also get access to specialized instruction, meaning you can have access to a special education teacher, a resource teacher, where they'll actually work with the child and teach them differently. And that's not necessarily something that comes along with the 504. So as it says for the basic description, the IEP is a specific blueprint or plan for the child's special education. And then the 504 is also a blueprint, but it's not necessarily for special education. It's how the school will provide support and remove barriers for a student with a disability. Providing support would be an accommodation. What are you going to do in addition, which is accommodating? Removing barriers could be a modification. So a modification could be in the form of a child that has a disability that their lower extremities or legs, they're not able to walk properly, or they're not able to walk independently. So a barrier could be stairs. So a 504 could be beneficial for an individual that doesn't have like full control of their legs or balance issues, or they can't ambulate up and down stairs. So a reasonable modification to remove a barrier could be things like being able to have access to an elevator or an alternative means to be able to get up and down the stairs. So in terms of what it does, IEP is special education. The 504 is changes within the environment. So a child that receives special education oftentimes will get pulled out and work with a special education teacher, an OT, an SLP, et cetera, in a different room, or it could even be push in service, but it's different. Whereas a 504, if a child's on a 504, they're likely going to be provided with services just in their general education classroom, but it will ensure that the child gets certain accommodations or modifications from the classroom teacher of whatever they need. In terms of the law that applies, I mentioned IDA earlier, and then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Who is eligible? So for special education in IEPs, you have to meet eligibility criteria from one of 13 eligibility categories, and then it has to adversely affect the child's educational performance in the general education classroom. There has to not only be an educational disability, but there also has to be a need for specially designed instruction. That's in contrast to a 504. It has to be a child with a disability, but it could be any disability, which is pretty much just limitless. A ton of disabilities could fall under a 504, whereas an IEP, there's only 13 eligibility categories. So a 504 could be any disability, and it has to interfere with the child's inability to learn or one or more basic life functionings, or basic life skills. So it can include 504 is someone with a disability that interferes with their learning, their communication, their thinking, etc. So it's more broad. And there's a note down here that says that's why a child who doesn't qualify for an IEP might be able to get a 504. It's more difficult, I would state, to be able to get a special education plan, an IEP, versus a 504. 504, if somebody has a disability and it interferes with a basic life activity, they're eligible. An IEP, they have to have one of 13 eligibility category or eligibility disabilities, and then it has to require specialized instruction. And usually the standards are just stricter for IEPs. So yeah. I alluded to independent educational evaluation before. So from the special education process or for IEPs and 504s, there has to be an evaluation for both. 504, there has to be some documentation of a disability. Same thing with an IEP and educational disability. For IEPs, if a parent disagrees with the school's evaluation, parents can ask for an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. So an IEE is basically, it's essentially a second opinion where you would go to a licensed psychologist in private practice, and you would get another evaluation, and then the district would have to consider the outside person's evaluation. It's at no cost to the parent. So it's completely free for a parent to have a second evaluation if they disagree with their school's evaluation. This is in contrast to a 504. Parents are not allowed to disagree with an evaluation. They're not allowed, or they're not entitled to an IE. They can have an outside evaluation, but they would have to pay for it themselves. So again, IEEs are requested if a parent disagrees with the school evaluation, and they're completely free to the parent. So goes away from IEEs, one letter off into IEP, back to IEPs. So IEPs are strict documents that basically has to have these 5 individuals I alluded to before: the parent, the teacher, general ed teacher, special ed teacher, someone that can interpret the instructional implications, and a district representative. And then there can be also other people. I alluded to OTs, PTs, SLPs, etc. before. For a 504, it's less specific who has to be there, but it could include the parent, a teacher, and principal. It might include those 2 or 3 people, and that's it. As opposed to the IEP has to have at least these 5. Individuals can serve multiple domains, so the school psychologist can be the individual to interpret instructional implications, and they also could be the district representative. So at a minimum, there could be 3 people at an IEP meeting: the parent, the general ed teacher, well, 4 people: parent, general ed teacher, special ed teacher, school psychologist, who's the individual to interpret the results, but also the district rep. What is in the IEP in 504? Quite a bit, and it's quite different. So just looking at the list, you can pretty much see that an IEP is more extensive than a 504. 504 has accommodations, who's going to provide it, and who's responsible to make sure that it's implemented. Who's going to implement the accommodation, and who is responsible for ensuring the plan is implemented, which could technically be the same person. So classroom teachers are the one providing the service, but they're also ensuring that it's being implemented, or it could be a district administrator, principal, etc. IEPs have a bunch of things. So they also have the accommodations, just like I said before with the 504, but it also will have a PLAF, is what is called, present levels, annual goals, the different services, the timing of services, if they're going to participate in standardized tests, etc. So in IEP, there is quite a bit more involved versus the 504. For the 2 IEP and 504s in terms of notice, the 504, the school must notify families about the evaluation or a change, but doesn't always have to be in writing. So a 504 could be basically a phone call where something gets done, versus an IEP. IEPs have to have written documentation that before you implement a different service in the school setting, the school personnel would have to give parents a prior written notice, basically documentation in writing, what they're going to do, and it's before the services take place. So a prior written notice is written after a decision's made, but prior to the services being implemented. That way parents know, or families know in advance before something is going to be done, that they have it in writing. So in terms of consent for the evaluation, so basically it's the same for IEPs and 504s. How often are they reviewed? 504s, it's pretty much every year with a 3-year reevaluation. Same thing with IEPs. IEPs must be reviewed every single year. In terms of an evaluation for special education, it has to be considered every 3 years, but it doesn't have, so it has to be, well, not just considered. Every 3 years, a child has to be reevaluated. A reevaluation could take the form of everybody meeting as a team, the same members that make up the IEP team, and determine that we don't have to do further testing, that reviewing a child's data and having a mean that the child continues to receive service, that can be enough. And those are most appropriate in cases where maybe the child has a known lifelong disability that's always going to impact them, and that's what the child receives special education services for. Then a reevaluation with additional testing, it may not be appropriate. It might be appropriate too, but that could be a good reason to not do an evaluation. If there's any disputes with an IEP or a 504, there's certainly different things that can be done that are similar. Mediation could be done for a 504 or an IEP. It could be a lawsuit, a state complaint, office civil rights complaint. For IDEA, it could be a due process complaint, which is a very formal process that's pretty anxiety provoking, could be. There's a lot of individuals involved, educational attorneys, things of that nature. In terms of cost, basically there's no cost for a child to have a 504 or an IEP to the parent. Students receive the services at no charge regardless because of it. Now for 504, states do not receive extra funding if a child has a 504, but federal government can take away from programs, including schools, that don't meet their legal duty to service kids with disabilities. And then IDEA funds can't be used to serve kids with 504s. That's in contrast to an IEP. States receive additional funding for students with IEPs. And depending on what the child qualifies for educational service-wise, which one of those 13 eligibility categories, the educational institution does receive different amounts depending on what the child qualifies for. So like, for instance, one of the eligibility categories is multiple disabilities with severe sensory impairment. That would essentially provide the school with more money than if a child qualified under, let's say, a specific learning disability. And the main reason is because if you have a child with MDSSI, there's likely going to be more needs involved than a child with a learning disability. So that's an overview of not only IEPs, 504s, special education, etc. That obviously doesn't cover everything under the sun in any of those areas, but it's enough to at least probably answer quite a few questions. If people have additional questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. I do free consultations over the phone. I got my number up there, as well as I do have quite a bit of information on my website. I do find myself to be a pretty humble person, or I try to be pretty humble, but I have got a lot of feedback in terms of people appreciating the amount of information on my website. So that's me relaying what other people have told me. But so you can find a lot of answers on there if you have specific questions about things, or you can feel free to give me a call. So anyway, that concludes this. I'll shoot it over to Fazia.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Andersen is easy to access. He's very helpful. Feel free to give him a call or check out his website. He'd be very helpful to you in the educational department there.